I'm Abby Weber, and I am a family and consumer science extension specialist for the southeast area of Colorado. So I serve the 8 counties here in the southeast area, all things family and consumer science. And one thing we do cover is sourdough, which is a lot of fun. It's kind of an up and coming hot topic. Everybody likes to learn about it. There's a lot of health benefits that people are really seeking with sourdough, and hopefully we can share some of that with you today. I would like to preface my presentation with a lot of the scientific, well, most of the scientific information that you're going to be getting in this presentation is collaborative work from Colorado State University and some research scientists in our food labs, and one in particular, Caitlin Clark, who does a tremendous amount of research on fermentation, including chocolate and sourdough. So who wouldn't love that job? But she does some really fun work, and she always shares with us, and I love the information she has. So a lot of the sciencey stuff is you're going to be getting from her today, or from me from her, which is great. For those of you who don't love the sciencey part of it, just hang tight. We have the fun part of it too. And at the end, our demonstration will be making our own sourdough starter. This is Penelope, so meet Penelope. And I also brought Alice. She's a whole wheat sourdough starter. So hopefully you guys will get to make your own and name it today. So that being said, we're going to launch the first poll. It's asking some questions about how many of you have participated in Get the Dish before? How many of you have participated in extension classes before? What's your experience level with making sourdough in particular? How many individuals are attending today in your lesson? Some of you guys might be attending with a coworker or a friend, or from your own kitchen. So we're just interested in who's participating today. It looks like we've heard from a little over half of you, so we'll give it just a little bit longer and then we'll share our results. Okay, we just have a couple more people to answer. Thank you, guys. We'll go ahead and end that poll. Share that maybe. Thanks. So it looks like several of you, this is your first time participating. So that's exciting, and we're glad you're here. And for those of you who are returning, welcome back, and we'll hope you'll attend some more. It looks like that some of you have no experience with sourdough, some of you have a little bit, and some of you are maybe more experienced than I am, which is fantastic. And then it looks like lots of you are attending by yourself, and some of you are here with a friend. And hopefully you guys can share your knowledge and share your love for sourdough when we're finished here. So welcome to everyone. We'll do another poll at the end. And when we do our other poll at the end, let's see, let me close this out. When we do our other poll at the end, if you complete your survey information, we have some giveaways, and I actually have some really fun giveaways. Not that the other presentations haven't been fun giveaways, but I like sourdough and I like to share. So we're going to give away this book. It's called The Perfect Loaf. We're also going to give you a weck jar for making your sourdough starter, we're going to give you a nice CSU extension towel to make sure that your bread rises well. And then I think I'll give you one of these little, I love these for mixing my sourdough. So we'll have a nice little package for you. So be sure that you complete your survey today for a chance to win that. So let's get started. We're going to talk about all things sourdough in this presentation, and sourdough is really the original leavened bread. Sourdough, let's talk about the sciencey kind of stuff first. Sourdough bread is leavened through the action of the wild consortium of yeast and bacteria, so the lactic acid bacteria, and sometimes also the acetic acid bacteria. The yeast and the bacteria live in a symbiotic relationship, and that's really what makes the sourdough healthy. And it means that they're both healthier together than they would be if they were separate of one another. All leavened bread was sourdough until the domestication of baker's yeast, which happened in about the 1700s. And then especially in the 1800s, when they started compressed yeast cakes, and those became marketed. Wild yeast were harvested and stored before this in both Western and Eastern baking traditions. So at this time, people didn't know what they were, and only that certain practices helped their bread rise. So the original sourdough, or the original live yeast, which is what our sourdough starter is, started clear back in the 1700s without even knowing it. So the organisms in sourdough perform two really important functions, and those two functions are leavening bread, number one, and that's mostly accomplished by the yeast, which produces carbon dioxide, or you guys know that as CO2. It's trapped by the gluten network in the dough, causing it to rise and expand. And then the second function is the acidification. And acidification is accomplished by the bacteria, and that's what makes the sourdough different from like regular bread, or what we call straight bread, store-bought bread, or like regular leavened bread that you make. It's made only with baker's yeast. And so the bacteria releases acid, which acidify the dough, and of course the resulting bread. And then that acidification has lots of functions, like giving it its sourdough flavor, which it's so famous for and people love. It improves the moisture retention, potential of starches and pentosins, and preventing staling of the bread. So sourdough, you'll notice a lot of people don't wrap it up and store it in like a Ziploc bag or an airtight bag like you would store regular yeast bread made with baker's yeast. Instead, they'll put it like in a linen bag or just like a cloth bag and cinch the sides. In fact, I didn't bring one with me today. I wish I would have. Let's talk about the benefits of sourdough. The microbiome of a sourdough starter affects its nutritional properties like flavor, aroma, texture, shelf life. Sourdough is considered to have an improved flavor and aroma properties compared to straight dough, or remember that's dough made with just baker's yeast. Compared to straight dough, sourdoughs also have improved nutrient bioavailability. It's reduced anti-nutritional factors, lower overall gluten content, and glycemic index. That's why, and we'll talk about this a little later in the presentation, but that's why a lot of people who have like a gluten sensitivity, not necessarily a gluten allergy like celiac, for instance, but a gluten sensitivity, are typically able to better digest sourdough. The functional properties of sourdough can mostly be attributed to the organic acids that are produced rather than the organisms themselves, which is kind of interesting, I think. First, the pH decrease achieved by the distribution of aids in the dough, improves gas retention, and water binding of gluten and starch, including the swelling of the pentosins and inhibits the flour amylase. So that's kind of why you notice the puffy bubbles in sourdough breads, and people do their best to achieve that kind of spongy looking crumb that's not a tight sponge, but kind of bloomed. And we'll talk about the crumb also a little further on in the presentation. Let's talk about baking terminology. So some of you who don't know anything about sourdough might not know what some of these terms are. So I'm just going to go through each one of them and just give a brief explanation of what they are. So when you do hear about these terms, or you are watching TikTok videos or YouTube videos after this presentation and decide you want to do sourdough, you're going to have a better understanding of what these terms are. So a starter is a mixture of flour and water containing wild yeast and bacteria. It's used to leaven sourdough bread or make it rise. And it can be made with a variety of flours, but should contain only flour, water, and wild organisms. So this guy is, or this girl actually, this is just regular all-purpose flour and water. That's it, all-purpose flour. This one, on the other hand, is whole wheat flour, only whole wheat flour and water. And I actually use bottled water. Where we're at, there's a lot of well water. And the thing about well water is it contains a high number of minerals that can sometimes kill that wild yeast that's growing. So it's really ideal to use like a bottled water, or bottled drinking water, especially if you're in a rural area or you're on well water. Dough yield. Dough yield is a measure that allows us to discuss the consistency of the sourdough starter. Dough yield is expressed as a number, which is arrived at by the equation flour weight plus water weight, those two added together, and then divided by the flour weight times 100. In other words, we could say that the starter weight divided by the flour weight and then multiply it by 100. A typical starter with the consistency of pancake batter has a dough yield of about 200. In all truthfulness, that's pretty much what I shoot for every time I mix my starter. When I discard and mix back, I go for that thick pancake consistency. We'll explain the differences in some of those dough yields a little bit further on also. But I pretty much stick to mostly the same thing. Ripe. A ripe starter is a starter that at its maximum capacity to rise bread, your starter is ripe when it's bubbling and has risen. This usually happens several hours after feeding. This sourdough was fed this morning at about, I don't know, 7:30 maybe. So when I discarded to half of what was below this purple rubber band. And then I fed it back so that the purple rubber band is where my sourdough started when I fed it this morning. It's grown this much since. So feasibly, it's still growing. Feasibly, I could probably use it right now as an active starter, and depending on my time frame, I might have. But today it's just going to grow. And I don't know if you can see all of the bubbles in this active starter, but I sure hope you can. So Penelope is really active. And then of course, Alice is super active also. Okay, discard. The term refers to the quality of starter that is, the quantity, excuse me, of starter that's thrown away each feeding cycle. Many bakers look for ways to use their discard, such as by making sourdough pancakes or biscuits, other discard recipes often include some other leavening agent like yeast or baking soda. Because discard isn't ripe, it's not usually able to rise or to raise the biscuits on its own, but it requires some other sort of like starter with it, like maybe a baker's yeast. I probably use more discard than I actually make sourdough. But I put discard in everything. So um, discard is really easy to use, and there's lots and lots of creative ways to use discard. So I hope you guys don't just throw your discard out, but instead I store mine in like a plastic container with a lid, and I can put it in the refrigerator. You'll see that your discard is, although it's not an active starter, you'll still see that it's really bubbly and has like kind of that sour smell. But it doesn't give like an odd flavor. My favorite thing is sourdough pancakes or sourdough discard waffles. And in all honesty, my favorite discard recipes I have found on TikTok. So fantastic resource. There's lots and lots of places to find fun discard recipes. But for me, that just happens to be my favorite place to find them. Proof is our next one. This term refers to the step in which the baker allows bread to rise after it has shaped. A couche is a heavy flax linen cloth, heavily dusted. Here's an example of that. Here's mine. I don't know if you can see the dusting inside of there. It's still got a lot of flour in it. And this cloth just comes off of my banneton. And it's heavily dusted with flour, and it's used to support loaves, usually baguettes, as they undergo final proofing. And what was I going to say about? Oh, the flour that you use in here sometimes does make a difference. You could use rice flour, which doesn't incorporate into the sourdough, and that's really handy. If I don't have rice flour, I just use regular, just all-purpose flour. So either one works fine. And then a banneton is a wooden basket, sometimes covered in cloth, used for proofing dough, usually not baguettes, but a boule or a batard shaped. And I actually have a baguette banneton too. Or you can use the baguettes like the one you see on the screen. That's just the really, really long loaves. This is more, I guess this really isn't baguette shaped. That's not fair. But these are the two different styles of bannetons that I have. And then score. To score bread means to make one or more cuts on the top of the loaf with a very sharp knife, or even better, a razor blade, something kind of like this. I didn't want to leave this laid open on the counter, but something kind of like this type of razor blade. This allows the bread to expand and rise in the oven, and it also lets the bakers make really pretty designs. You'll see a lot of sourdough that has pretty designs on the top of it. And those are made with very, very sharp razor blades. And then a lame. A lame is a razor blade mounted on a handle, often pressed into a curved shape using a washer that's used for scoring loaves. So this little razor blade can go right on here. Oh, maybe. I will show you this example. I will show you. There we go. And I'm able to score my sourdough. So there are some really important terms that you'll see with sourdough. Whoops. So let's talk about the first things first. Let's talk about the starter. We're going to talk about what it contains, how to feed it, how often, and how to use dough yield to your advantage. Some people are really consistent with how they use their dough yield. Caitlin Clark in particular is one of those. She has about 35 or so starters at a time that she maintains and manages. I have two currently, just the two that I brought to share with you guys. And that's enough for me. I have two children, and so with two children and two sourdough starters, that's about all I can handle. Let's talk about our okay, so this happens to be a very busy slide with a lot of information on it. And unless you're in a lab, this might not mean anything to you. But really the key concept is that every starter is different, which is the really cool thing about sourdough, because it doesn't matter if I mix my starter in this kitchen and you mix your starter in this kitchen, our starters will be different. A 2021 study sequenced the microbiomes of about 500 starters gathered from home and commercial bakers, and they found that they were almost all unique, covering a really huge variety of yeast and bacteria both, which I thought was really cool. So really the important takeaway here is just to understand that there is a huge variety of organisms that are all being used to make sourdough all across the world. The image on the right reflects the recent research of Dr. Caitlin Clark at Colorado State University, in which she investigated 20 sourdough starters, all of which contain different microbiomes. So she and her team looked at how these different microbiomes affected chemical and physical properties of the resulting dough and the bread, like pH, water activity, crumb compressibility, like how spongy it is, crust color, and rise volume. And really here, the key takeaway is that different starters produce different results. So the message here is that what works for your starter might not work for my starter, especially if we're in different locations, altitude, moisture, all of those things do affect your starter growth and activity. So we're going to be talking a lot about what I do and what CSU has done in our lab and what Dr. Clark has found in her research also. So just keep in mind that what works for us might not necessarily work for you. However, also keep in mind that sourdough is very forgiving. I think sometimes you see videos or people talk about sourdough like it's this really complex thing and it's so hard to do. And really, it's so much easier than we try to make it. So a starter is maintained by feeding it on a regular schedule, approximately every 24 hours. Every time you feed it, you discard an amount and then add more flour and water. Most sources say to discard about 50%, but I found that discarding about 70% works best for me. I get the most growth and the better dough yield out of my starter if I discard about 70% as opposed to 50%. But 50% is pretty average. And then the reason we discard starter and feed it with new flour and water is for the fact that the bacteria grow faster than the yeast. And so we want to maintain that yeast bacteria symbiosis. If you control the dough yield or the consistency of your starter by the ratio of flour and water that you feed it with after discarding, you can change your dough yield. So once again, dough yield is the flour weight plus the water weight divided by the flour weight times 100 for you math people that really like that stuff. But for me, pancake consistency works. So that's where I stay. Here's, like I said, I showed you two of my starters. Here are two of Dr. Clark's starters. One has a really high dough yield, about 300, and the one on the left has about 150 dough yield. And you can see, so that would be closer to like mine. The one on the right-hand side is like more liquidy. There's it's more watery. Both of these starters are ripe, but you really can't see that. Because the one on the, you can't see the one on the right rising because it's so liquid that it doesn't hold the bubbles. You can only tell it's ripe by the smell. And really, once you kind of get to know your starter, you'll have that experience with it, and you'll know what that looks like. So maybe if it's gotten to this at one point and it has been really ripe, and then you decide that you're going to make the dough yield higher, and you're going to make it more liquid, you'll know when that starter is more moist, but still ripe. So the starter on the right is a lot easier to work with as a starter, but it's easier to stir. It's easier to clean the containers. For those of you who have experience with sourdough starters, when it dries on something, it's like concrete. So it's really hard to manipulate, clean off, scrape, whatever. But the dough yield of the starter on the right, like, changes that. I'm not very happy with the results when I bake with the one on the right, but the one on the left is more sticky. It's harder to stir and makes a huge mess, but it really makes a more like beautiful loaf of bread. It also reduces the bulk fermentation and proofing times. So a stiffer starter with a dough yield of about 150 works best. Again, I keep all of mine around 150. If you don't plan to bake for a few days, though, you can go more with the one on the right. When I put my sourdough starter in the refrigerator for, I don't know, sometimes weeks at a time, I have a much higher dough yield starter. It's very much more liquidy. There's no reason to use, let's go back. I switched to a higher dough yield so that the starter is easier to deal with. If I know I want to bake within the next couple of days, I drop back to a lower dough yield and get the starter back into like baking shape. And so then when we're talking about baking or feeding back our starters, there's really no reason to use bread flour for your starter, although you should use a high protein flour. Like bread flour when you're making your bread. Regular or all-purpose flour has a protein content of about 10 to 12%. And bread flour has a protein content of like 12 to 14%. So using bread flour is actually a higher protein content, as is your like wheat flour or rye flour. A lot of people make their sourdough with rye flour. Incidentally, whole wheat flour has a fairly high protein content, right around about 13% or so, but it's not ideal to use 100% whole wheat flour for bread dough. So I use 100% whole wheat flour for my sourdough starter, but then when I go to make my sourdough, I do not use whole wheat flour. I typically use bread flour. An established starter will be happy with just about any kind of flour. You can even use bleached flour. Really not ideal, but if that's all you have, it's perfectly fine to use that. Whatever is in the flour bin. But the really cool thing about a sourdough starter, discarding and feeding, is that when you feed it back and say I only have whole wheat flour in my cabinet, I can actually mix whole wheat flour in this all-purpose starter and it's going to be just fine. It's going to change up the complexity of my starter, which sometimes is really fun. Sometimes can give it a little bit different flavor. And then you can discard to the point where you'll actually work back to just AP flour, but you'll still have some of the components of that whole wheat in there, which is, I think, is sometimes kind of fun. Okay, basic steps to making sourdough. Let's talk about those of you who just want to know how to make sourdough and what it takes. Let's talk about that. We'll start with the mixing and the kneading. In the simplest version of this step, all ingredients are mixed together in a sourdough recipe. Ingredients are generally expressed as percent by weight relative to the weight of the flour in the recipe. This is called a baker's percentage. And I actually use a baker's scale when I go to mix my sourdough loaf. I do not use a scale when I am mixing back my starter. We're going to use one today. For those of you who don't do sourdough and have never done it, I'm going to show you how to do that. Or I'm going to show you how to convert that using, if for those of you who don't have a kitchen scale, measuring cups. So I kind of measure with my heart when I mix back my sourdough starter. Not everybody does that, but I just mix till I have my pancake consistency. Then, this is the more complex process, and we're not really going to go into great detail about it today. But there's some really good YouTube videos on this part. An alternative to simply mixing all of the ingredients is to engage in an autolysis or a pre-ferment step. There's some people who mix the pre-ferment and the autolysis together. So they'll mix some of the components, sprinkle it with salt, let it set aside for a couple of hours and pre-ferment. And then they'll start with an autolysis and then mix the two together. There's lots of different strategies to doing that. Unless I have a lot of time, I don't use the pre-ferment. I typically do the whole mix to start. So, but there's some great resources for the pre-ferment and the autolysis. I'll tell you what Caitlin Clark does, because she describes it in really good detail in some of her presentations. She says her strategy is to mix about 15% of her flour and 15% of her water together with 100% of her starter. Then she makes that pre-ferment. She sets it aside for 3 to 4 hours. From experience, she knows that that's about as much time as it takes. And then at first it will feel really ragged, but by the time it's bubbly, it will be very sticky. After her pre-ferment has been bubbling for about 2 hours, she prepares an autolysis with the remaining ingredients. And she says she mixes all of her remaining flour and water together very loosely to make a really ragged dough. Without the moisture from the starter, it won't really come together very smooth yet. Then she sprinkles the salt on top, but she doesn't mix it in. She covers the autolysis with a lid and sets it aside for about an hour. That gets to her 3 hours, or until her pre-ferment appears maximally risen and bubbly. Then she adds the pre-ferment with the autolysis. And once they're combined, then all of her dough ingredients are combined and they simply need to be mixed and gently kneaded until the dough is smooth. And she will mix in a container like this that is clear and you can see markings on there, or you can use a piece of tape or some sort of marker that will allow you to see the growth of the dough, and has a tight sealing lid to keep the dough moist. If I don't have the lid like this when I mix mine, I actually use a shower cap. So next time you're at a hotel, don't throw away these little shower caps that they give you for free in the bathroom. Keep a hold of them and use them for your sourdough starter. You can also put this on the top of your banneton, and it allows plenty of growth for your dough in your banneton. So, and shower caps are really easy to manipulate with different bowl sizes and such. So that's kind of nice. Then we're going to talk about bulk ferment. Some people find that this step replaces the traditional kneading. I don't find that to be true for sure. I still do some little bit of like abbreviated kneading. And then after I mix all my ingredients, I don't find that just the stretch and folds are important. I actually do the stretch and folds with a little bit of kneading incorporated. So, or my kneading first, and then I'll do stretch and folds. There's two reasons to perform some version of the step. The first is to degas the dough. The gas being produced, like we talked about earlier, is carbon dioxide, and it reacts with the water in the dough to form carbonic acid. And so degassing releases those large pockets of carbon dioxide that are formed early, like when you're fermenting things. And then carbonic acid slows the microorganism activity, and we don't want to do that. So preventing it keeps from the fermentation proceeding at a steady rate. So acid also leads to the gluten breakdown. And so degassing prevents acid formation that could be counterproductive for gluten formation. And then sourdough will produce some acid anyway, but the dough shouldn't really get acidic until later. So for now, we want to keep carbonic acid really kind of at a minimum. And then we're going to talk about shaping. Once your dough has risen to its desired volume, cut a piece of the desired weight for your loaf, and then gently lay it on a floured surface. Like I was talking about earlier, I really like rice flour because it doesn't incorporate. So it won't get really sticky. And then you pull the corners of the dough ball up and around to the center so that they meet in the middle, and you kind of pinch it to make a little seam. And then this should make the bottom of the loaf stretch into a really tight, kind of smooth surface. And then you can turn that over and you use your hands to kind of push, not push forward, but rock forward over the dough and like scoop your fingers under the side, and you tuck that, and you're kind of like growing the shape of the dough. The reason we work so hard to create surface tension when we're doing that is that it helps the dough rise upward and get a taller loaf. And a slack, unshaped loaf tends to be more like kind of a pancake. And then it gets like really dense and not spongy at all. So we want to try to keep some of those gas bubbles at this point trapped inside when we're doing the shaping. We don't really have time today to watch these. Let's see. Let me go backwards here. Can I go back? I just keep going forward, but we don't really have time. There's two YouTube videos on there that are really good about shaping sourdough. And so I encourage you that if that's something you're interested in or don't really know how to shape your sourdough once you get to that point, those are fun to watch. You can find some really short, great video clips on that. Let's talk about proofing. Why a banneton works. So during the proofing step, the shaped loaves are allowed to rise once again. And you're kind of retrapping some of the gas that was knocked out of them during the shaping stage. And here you're kind of developing that maximum gluten network. So this step can occur kind of free form on a baking tray, but best results occur if you give your loaf some kind of support during this step. So for baguettes, you're going to want to use a couche. For loaves, you're going to want to use some sort of banneton. And proofing takes a few hours, and you don't want your loaf to dry out. So it's essential to cover your banneton with something that will prevent it from drying out. In Colorado, the air is much more dry. So covering ours with something like this, which is actually just a reversible bowl cover, doesn't work so well for me. It's pretty, but a shower cap works much better because it holds the moisture in. You want your loaf to stay moist. The best results though come from what we call a proofing bag. And these actually are reusable. You can buy them in bulk. I just get a large quantity of them on Amazon, but you can actually stick the whole Banneton in this bag. Give it a couple of twists on the end and just tuck it under. And there's plenty of room for that dough to rise and still keep it moist. These are definitely reusable too, as long as they stay clean and you make sure that the moisture comes out of it. So I often just turn mine inside out after I use it, and then I turn it back right side out when I'm going to use it again. Let's see. We're going to talk about scoring. Scoring is usually done with a tool called a lom, which is a razor blade mounted on a handle like this that we talked about. The purpose of scoring is to show the loaf where you want it to open when it rises, as opposed to exploding at the greatest point of pressure. Not ideal. A good score must be deep enough to allow for maximum rise, but it must be performed with a very sharp tool, which is why we use a lom instead of a knife. In the absence of a lom, a freshly sharpened knife can be used, but you want it to be really, really sharp. To achieve the ear like you see in this loaf right here, which is a perfect ear on a loaf, you need a sharp edge on the score that flips up as it bakes, and the score must occur at an angle. It can't be, you just don't cut it right down the middle. Instead, you're going to cut it on an angle. It must be done with a very sharp razor blade and very quickly. About a 45-degree angle makes a really perfect ear. So baking. Baking is really important. So make sure that your oven is very hot, at least 450 degrees. And 450 degrees, I usually turn mine up just a little bit more than that. And then I will put my crock in there at 450 degrees. And the reason I turn it up a little higher than 450 is because every time you open that oven door, a little bit of that heat escapes, and you want it to be 450 for sure when you start baking. So I turn it up just a little until I actually get my loaf in, and then I'll turn it back down to 450. I bake in a Dutch oven. You don't necessarily have to bake in a Dutch oven. I most often do. I bake about a 700 or 800 gram loaf by the time I'm finished in a Dutch oven at 450 for about 40 minutes. I keep the lid on for the first 35 minutes, and then the last 5 minutes I remove the lid. And when the baking time is over, I turn off the oven and remove the loaf from the Dutch oven. And I just drop it into my Dutch oven on a pretty little piece of parchment paper. So I pick up my loaf with the parchment paper and drop it right into my Dutch oven. And then whether you cool it in the oven or make sure that you remove it from the Dutch oven and place it on a wire rack. Don't put it right down on your counter or on a hard surface, because you will end up with a soggy bottom, and nobody likes a soggy bottom. So just make sure that you dry or cool your loaf on a wire rack or something where air can flow underneath, and you keep that crumb. So let's go to some quick tips and tricks, and then we're going to move on to making a starter. It won't take us long at all to make a starter, but let's talk about making a crispy crust. So avoid enriched dough. To achieve a perfectly crisp crust, ingredients like oil and sugar make the dough softer and can prevent that crust from crisping. So form a very tight stretched surface over the dough, And then once you get that surface tension on there, remember you're going to use your lom to make your ear on your dough, or to make your designs on your dough. Proof the dough in a banneton, lined or floured, or in a bowl lined with a tea towel. Some people just proof in a regular glass bowl, which is perfectly fine. To develop a crispy crust, you must create steam in your baking environment. So an ideal way to do this is to bake in a Dutch oven. If your loaf contains moisture, it will become steam in the oven, and the Dutch oven will trap that steam. If you can't do that, some people have put like a cake pan in the bottom of the oven with water, with plenty of water in it. Mind you, not a glass cake pan, because it will crack, to create the steam in the oven. And so to get a beautiful ear, you score in a rapid motion with a very sharp tool at a deep 45-degree angle, and keep the oven door closed as much as possible. Although it's fun to peek at our baking, it's not necessary to peek at your sourdough bread. It will come out perfect. Then look at this beautiful open crumb with perfect bubbles. That's a beautiful sourdough right there. Whoop. I feel like I can't go backwards. We're just really talking about a perfect crumb there. So we want to avoid really large bubbles directly under the crust, because that creates like a tunneling, and it's not very pretty. And then underproofing can also lead to tunneling, as the yeast go through an aggressive burst of activity during the oven spring phase, because your bread will spring a little bit in the oven too. So overproofing can also lead to poor crumbs, since the gluten can overdevelop, leading to a loose crumb, and it doesn't hold gas bubbles in place, and it just becomes really dense. And then we're gonna skip this part, the rye flour part, but we're gonna briefly talk about gluten and sourdough. So gluten and sourdough. Gluten is a complex of two proteins that work together to form a structure of most of our bread products. Gluten proteins are present in wheat, rye, and barley. But the protein in wheat provides the best structural properties of bread, which is why we usually use wheat flour for baking. People with celiac disease, or in the next few slides, you're going to see that as CD, and some other conditions such as non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or NCGS. That means that you don't necessarily have a allergy, but you are sensitive to it. Specifically, they're sensitive to peptides resulting from a partial breakdown of proteins. Some research shows that organisms that are present in sourdough can break down gluten, and can even degrade the specific peptides that are harmful to people with celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It has only been investigated on a very small number of many possible organisms associated with sourdough, though. Remember, we said sourdough is so complex, and there's so many different sourdough live yeasts that it's hard to really tell at this point if it actually works for all people with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. So Colorado State University conducted the first ever survey of gluten sensitive consumers who eat sourdough. Our team did this because they found a lot of anecdotal reporting about how sourdough reduces symptoms of gluten sensitivity, but they really couldn't find any evidence about it. So our research lab actually wanted to collect their own evidence. And you can see right here kind of what we came up with. Our food science lab and graduate researchers looked at 3 groups of people: those with celiac disease, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and those who were undiagnosed but self-reported gluten sensitivity. They found that only those in the undiagnosed group experienced fewer symptoms with sourdough than the other bread products. They also found that people in the undiagnosed group scored higher on a gluten knowledge test and also had some demographic differences, that they were more likely to be female and older. Ultimately, they didn't find any difference between the three groups in terms of how frequently they consumed sourdough bread, which I thought was really interesting. And then they discovered that among participants who find sourdough reduce the symptoms of their gluten sensitivity, the main change to their symptoms were the reduction in bloating and abdominal pain, which is typically what you hear from people with gluten sensitivity. And also among the three diagnosed, or the three groups, taste is a major reason for choosing sourdough. Interestingly, they found that some members of all three groups have the mistaken belief that sourdough is actually a probiotic. So, let's see. Now I think we're going to go ahead and make a starter. There's some additional resources you can see on this last page. And I think there's a couple that you can drop in the chat, Sandy, if you want. I'm going to stop sharing my screen though. Yeah, and we have just about enough time to make a starter here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right, and I'm going to move my table back. I'm going to show you my countertop. So we're going to make a starter together. And I am going to start by, for those of you who are working right along with me, feel free to get out a scale or some measuring cups and measuring spoons. And I'll put the rest of my apron back on. And we are going to turn on our scale and zero our scale. And mine says pounds and ounces. And I'm going to change it so that it says grams. Now mine says 0 grams, and I'm going to put my wet jar. If you don't have a wet jar, you can use a regular glass jar or a canning jar, whichever you have on hand. I'm going to put my jar right on here, and then I'm going to re-zero my scale. And I'm going to make my starter with a high protein flour. We're extension, so we don't really endorse any particular product, but this happens to be the flour that I'm using. And I'm just going to measure out 60 grams of this whole wheat flour. Measure out 60 grams of whole wheat flour. Or about a half a cup. If you don't have a scale, about a half a cup of flour. Then going to use some bottled water. And this is just purified drinking water. Your brand does not matter. I'm going to open this spatula. And I'm going to measure out. You can either zero your scale or measure or add another 60 to your 60 previously, which would be 120. Okay, that's it. That's all for our starter, except now we're going to stir it really well. You're going to notice it's really liquidy. You make sure that you get all of your flour parts mixed in. You don't want any flour clumps. You want to make sure that it's really well mixed. And then I push mine all down to the bottom. So you'll see that it's pretty thick in there right now. I push it all down to the bottom with my scraper. And this is the first day of our starter. So for the first day of our starter, for the first 24 hours, that's it, by the way. The first 24 hours, we're gonna leave it just like this. We're not gonna do anything with it. Tomorrow, I'm gonna cover it actually lightly. You can cover it with a paper towel and a rubber band to secure that if you like. Sometimes I just use the glass top of my weck jar with no ring or fasteners. Or I will just use a jar topper that you can just fold right over the top. So he'll stay sitting there for 24 hours. And then after the first 24 hours, all I'm going to do is mix this again. So for the first 2 days, it's just going to be this. Okay. Then after the first 2 days, I will put a rubber band around my jar where I will have discarded. And I'll show you how to discard actually. I can show you how to discard this sourdough for those of you who are interested and to mix back. Actually, just going to discard into this bowl. So I'm going to mix my starter that is very active. And you'll see that when I've mixed it, the bubbles decrease. And I'm going to drop it right down into this bowl. And I remember I usually discard about 70%, not 50%. So there was my rubber band where it started, and I'm just going to start there. And I'll take about a half a cup of flour. And again, I don't measure when I'm feeding back. So I'm just going to add a little bit of water and then stir till I feel like it feels good. We're looking for a thick pancake consistency here. And all pieces of the flour mixed in. Okay. So it looks about like that. And again, I'm going to scrape the sides down. And then I'm going to move my rubber band to where the top of my starter is. And then I'll know it's active when it grows double in size. Okay. And it'll kind of get flat on the top. So, are there any questions, Sandy, that I might be able to answer?
You do have one question. I'm also going to go ahead and post the final class survey.
That'd be great.
Second, and I can pull up that question. So I'm going to post the links for the survey and if you have any issues, the password is dish, all lowercase, DISH. And your question today is from Danielle. So Danielle writes, I have so many questions about starter and discard. If using 100% of the starter, then you would be left with nothing. So why then would you not use some of the discard to make another starter? I have been told that because the starters would get out of control, but again, if using all of the starter, you would then have none left, right? Am I missing something here?
Okay, that's a really complex question. So I'm going to try to answer it the best I can. And please make sure that you let me know if I missed a piece of this. You don't want to use 100% of your starter. I can't think of a time where I've ever used 100% of my starter. You'll always keep a little bit of starter, just like I did when I discarded, in the bottom so that you can add to it. If you want your starter to grow, you can add, like if this is not a big enough starter for you, you can actually add double the amount of flour when you feed back, but you have to add double the amount of water also. And then when you discard down to 50% of what you added. So you're always going to have some of your starter left. Your discard is this extra stuff that can be used for something else. Okay. So this is the part that I store in the refrigerator or add to other doughs that I'm making or whatever that looks like. So I guess my answer is I don't know that you should ever be getting down to 0 of your starter, because if you do that, you'll have to start over, and it takes about 7 days on average for your starter to become fully active again. So then you're out of sourdough starter for about a week. You can use some discard to create another starter, but this really is like your discard is another starter. It's just not active. So you can't use it at that point. Then you're going to have to feed it and let it get active. I think that answered what you were asking. Please let me know if I'm wrong.
Yes, so it looks like it did help. You also have one more question from Tony. How much water was used originally?
So I used 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water initially. And then when I fed back my other starter, when I fed back this one, I just know what it feels like. So I just kind of eyeballed it. But if if you're not experienced with that, and this is new to you, you could add back when you discard the first time, which won't be for 48 hours. When you discard the first time, you're going to add 60 grams or about a half a cup of flour back to this. And then you're going to add about almost a half a cup of water back also, or 60 grams.
Okay, you have one last question.
Okay.
I'm trying to make sure I capture them all. Would a butter churn jar be good for stirring?
A butter churn jar, I suppose you could. I've never done that, but I would suggest that you stir by hand or stir with your own spatula. It doesn't take much to stir it, but you really kind of need to know what that feels like so you understand what your dough yield is like when you are stirring it back. Because you really need to kind of see and feel that consistency.
And one more question. After you discard, where do you put the jar, counter, or fridge?
If your starter is fully active, you can store it in the refrigerator after you discard and feed it back. Then you can store it. Like I could put this guy in the fridge right now because he's really active. If I know I'm not going to use it for about a week, or even longer, I've had it in there for a month before. I just stick it in the fridge like this. This one that we just made cannot go in the refrigerator or should not go in the refrigerator until it's fully active. So it should be sitting on the counter in about a room temperature spot or some place kind of warm, about 70 degrees-ish, for about 7 days on average till it gets completely active. I sometimes use a little cloth like this because it is starting to get fall time and a little chilly. So I will put my jar in something like this to keep it kind of warm on the counter. And it just looks like one of those kind of old time like ice bags, you know. But this is just a piece of felt with elastic sewn in the top. So just keeps my jar warm.
Awesome.
Oh, the other thing I've done to make sure it doesn't dry out, I will put my jar like this. Instead of leaving it on the counter when it's cold in the winter, I will put it in the oven and turn the light on in the oven and just leave it till morning when I get out to feed it again.
Awesome, thank you. I think that was the last of the questions, and please make sure to complete the post survey for the class and check us out for future classes. I'll be doing one actually next week on cooking with dried and fresh peppers, so I look forward to seeing some of y'all.
And then also before you go, please complete our final poll that I just put up there. And Cindy said, definitely fill out our survey that she put in the chat. And if you fill that out, you're entered to win an item. And so I also want to announce that Tina Imlay is our winner from last week's class. So we'll be connecting with you to get you your prize.
I know I went a little over the timer, but I hope everybody was at least able to stay. So I apologize, respect for all of you guys' time.
I'll give another 15 or 20 seconds for the poll. Most of you have answered it, and we look forward to seeing you at our future classes. Thank you, Abby. I'm inspired to go try making some sourdough myself.
If you don't want to make it, Amy, just call me. I'll send you some, like, green chili sourdough, since that's what we're famous for in this area of Colorado.
Ooh, that sounds delicious. All right. Looks like everyone has answered. Again, thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you next week.